Hello, fourth graders. We're on chapter 24. Mistakes along the way. The Mighty One, God the Lord, speaks and summons the earth from the rising of the sun to its setting. Psalm 50, verse 1. Effects of original sin. Do not eat from it, for if you do, you shall die. With these words, God told Adam and Eve what would happen if they chose to turn away from him. Poor Adam and Eve thought that they knew better than God, but of course they did not. When they disobeyed, Adam and Eve became subject to death, and they would have to die someday. They also lost grace. The gates of heaven were closed to them. So when God says they'll do not eat from it, particularly the tree of knowledge of good and evil, for if you do, you shall die. Well, they're going to die physically, but also they kill the life of grace. They destroy their friendship with God. In two ways, death takes place. Well, they're going to die physically one day, but then there's an immediate spiritual death. Their relationship with God is broken. Adam and Eve were not the only ones to suffer from their disobedience. All of their descendants suffer as well, beginning with Cain, Abel, and Seth, all the way down to everyone who is alive today, including you. Your body, just like the bodies of Adam and Eve, is going to die someday. And you, like everyone except Jesus, who is God, and Mary, through a special gift, came into being in your mother's womb without God's life of grace in your soul. So Mary's special gift was what we call the Immaculate Conception. But even us, when we begin to exist within our mother, we have the stain on our soul. All right. By Christ's suffering and death, he won back for us God's life of grace. He gave us the sacrament of baptism, through which we receive this grace. But even with grace in our souls, there is still the results of original sin in us. There is something wrong with us. And that is what we are going to read about now. But before we begin, we must talk about your conscience. All right, so what they're talking about here, original sin, Adam and Eve, their sin begins what's called original sin. Is passed on by origin, by generation, which really it's the lack of what we would have if Adam and Eve didn't sin. So imagine your parents have a big bank account, massive bank account, but then they lose all the money. When your parents die, it's not going to get passed on. There's nothing to pass on. That's kind of what Adam and Eve did. They kind of ruined the spiritual bank account they had for them and for all their descendants, all of us, the life of grace. So they lose it, so we don't get it. So original sin seems primarily it's a lack of what we would have gotten if Adam and Eve didn't botch the program, if they hadn't disobeyed God. All right. But we still, even the grace, baptism, brings us into friendship with God, restores the life of grace. There's still some lingering effects, all right, of original sin. So your conscience. From the time you were a baby, you have been learning to distinguish right and wrong. Your parents said no when you hit your brother or sister. To make sure that you would know what is right, they encouraged you, for example, to share your toys with others. As you grew older, you learned even more ways of being good. Eventually, you learned the 10 Commandments, which are really big helps to knowing right from wrong. You have the ability to judge what you must do to avoid sin and do good, using the knowledge you have gained about right and wrong. For example, you might want to go to your friend's house after school. Then you remember that your mother said to come home right away. From the 4th commandment, you have learned that you must obey your mother. Therefore, you decide that to go to your friend's house would be wrong. This judgment about how you ought to act or not act is called your conscience. So very important. We see here it's the kind of that judgment that we make of, okay, here's I can either go to my friend's house or go home as my mom has told me. And conscience helps me make that my decision, my judgment is I know it's the right thing to do and I'm going to do it. All right. Really, it's a helpful, let's see here, a helpful way of looking at it. It's just somewhat helpful. I can pull this out here. All right. So we have conscience. We could say, so like in math, we have to make judgments about, we see 2 plus 2 equals, okay, you're going to solve that problem. You got to know what 2 and 2 and what this sign means. And then you can make 4, right? All right, so here's you could say math conscience. It's really, here's the numbers, and then applying what you know about math to get the answer. So you have that, either listen to my mom or friend's house first, right? And you have a choice here. Well, I know it's right. I'm going to choose this one. Listen to my mom. All right. So that's what conscience is. It's that the act of judgment, of knowing what to do. All right. I can disobey my conscience by saying, I'm going to go look at my friends, even though I know what the right thing to do is. When I decide, nope, I'm not going to do the right thing. It's when we go against our conscience. Sin. Oops. Now we will see how, as a result of Adam's sin, you are a little mixed up and upside down. And me too. Sometimes, although you know what you should do, you decide for things, your desire for things and your feelings are out of order. So even though you know you should listen to your conscience, by which you judge that something you want to do is wrong, you do it anyway. Sometimes you let your desires and your feelings, instead of your conscience, rule over your actions. For example, you might know that you must obey your mother and come straight home after school. But maybe you give in to your desire to go to your friend's house and you act against what you know is right. Or you might know that it is wrong to hit your brother out of anger. But when he teases you, you let yourself get so angry that you hit him anyways. Sometimes your desires and feelings might be so strong that it might be hard to be good even when you are trying very hard. When we choose to do something that we know is against God's law, we sin. Adam and Eve committed the first sin, and this is the one of the reasons that we call it the original sin. All other sins after the first are called actual sins. These are sins that we ourselves commit, do by choice. Ever since Adam and Eve, people traveling on the road to heaven have gotten at least a little lost by committing sins. We are. So sin is when I do what I know I ought not to do, but I feel or desire, I want to do it anyways because there's something out of it. I want to do it with my friends, even if my mom has told me not to go to my friend's house first, come home right away. Mortal sin. It is possible for a person to get lost in a big way. This happens when he breaks God's law in a serious way. Although he really knows that it is a serious matter, he chooses to do it anyway. In this case, we say that his sin is mortal. For a sin to be mortal, it also has to be done after thinking about it. It has to be done on purpose and freely, without being forced into it. Mortal means something that causes death, like a mortal wound. Okay, so mortal sin kills the life of grace in the soul, breaks friendship with God. By committing mortal sin, the person turns away from God and starts heading toward hell. Essentially, you're saying, God, no, I don't want to have my life directed toward you. All of us get lost in small ways. Although we are still headed toward God, we slow down or take a wrong turn. This kind of sin is called venial sin. We commit a venial sin when our offense is not serious enough for a mortal sin, but still breaks God's law. Or perhaps we do not fully realize what we are doing, or we are under pressure. When we commit venial sins, we still love God, but we offend him in little ways. It is important to try to love God as much as possible by staying away from even venial sins. We are careless about taking care of the little sicknesses of our soul. If we are careless about taking care of the little sicknesses of our soul, venial sins, we will end up getting really sick by committing mortal sin. These are 4 different ways by which we must try to show our love for God in our thoughts. Sometimes our thoughts are not what they should be. For example, when we think about something unkind about another. In our words, sometimes our words don't show our love for God. For example, an example of this would be telling a lie. In our actions, 3, our actions. Our actions can be displeasing to God. For example, in the case of stealing. And finally, 4, there are the things that we should have done but did not do, like not doing a chore our parents told us to do. We call these sins of omission. To omit something means to leave it undone. What a happy thing for us that God gives us his grace so that we can win the battle against our wrong desires. We must pray to be good, and we must pray to have holy and good desires. We must, in order for us to receive this grace, Jesus gives us a great sacrament that heals our souls of the damage done to them by our sins. He also gives us special grace not to commit those sins again. That is what we will read about in the next chapter. Sacrament of penance, reconciliation, confession. That's what we'll read about next chapter. All right, but this chapter was kind of on the more on the damage that we can do to ourselves, the sin we can do. And so there's by thought, words, actions, and by omission. So 4 different ways. And it's important to know it's especially thoughts. Sometimes we have thoughts that aren't good. If we push them away, it's not a sin. If you just push them, I don't want that thought, go back to what I was doing, get my attention on something else, there's no sin. It's when we kind of dwell and brew on that. We're like stirring it. Yeah, I want to keep thinking about that bad thing I could do to this person or this stuff I shouldn't be thinking about. That's when it becomes a sin. All right, but when we just push them away, I like using the image of flies. You just treat them like flies. You just push them away. No, I'm not going to give you attention. Just gently push them away and go back to what you were doing. What is sin? Sin is an offense done to God by disobeying his law. What was Adam's sin? Adam's sin was a grave sin of pride and disobedience. It was the first sin ever committed, so it is called original sin. So it was out of pride, and he disobeyed God, and then pride of I don't need God. I can Adam and Eve were told by the serpent that if they eat it, they'll become like God. God's holding something back from you. So they don't have humility that God is going to, as the creator, he's going to provide. They want to take for themselves. What damage did Adam's sin cause? Adam's sin affected him and all men. It removed God's grace and gifts from man and caused man to suffer illness, death, ignorance, and temptation to sin. So when we removed God's grace, there was the suffer of illness, death. It's hard to know what is true, ignorance, and then tempted to sin. So this inclination, it's easier to do what's wrong and easier to do the wrong. It's harder to do the good. What was original sin for Adam and Eve? Original sin for Adam and Eve was a sin they committed when they broke God's commandment. So original sin for Adam and Eve was their first actual sin. All right. What is original sin? Well, for us, original sin is the lack of grace with which we come into existence. It is a result of the sin of our first parents, Adam and Eve. It is not a sin we commit ourselves. So it's the lack of grace, as it says here, the lack of what we would have gotten if Adam and Eve hadn't sinned. Right, that spiritual bank account, if you will. How is original sin taken away? Original sin is taken away by the sacrament of baptism, because we get the life of grace, friendship. But there's still some lingering effects, like this tendency. It's still hard to do what is good all the time. It's still this tendency of doing bad. It can sometimes be, what's wrong to do sometimes looks more appealing, and so we choose it. We choose the wrong at times. What is actual sin? Actual sin is a sin that is committed voluntarily, freely, by one who has the use of reason. All right, so little children, like toddlers, infants, they can't commit actual sin. But when we reach the age of 6 or 7, then we're pretty firm on what we're able, actual sin. We're pretty free on making our decisions. Before that, you can be stinkers, and your ability to make free decisions fully, it's growing. So But when we reach about the age of 7, that's when we begin commit. Our actions are more and more voluntary, free. How many ways is actual sin committed? Thoughts, words, in deeds, in omissions. That is what we fail to do. How many actual sins are there? Kinds of actual sin? Mortal and venial. Mortal sin is an act of disobedience to the law of God in a serious matter, done with full knowledge and deliberate consent. It has to be really bad. I have to know it's really bad, and I do it anyway. Those are the 3 conditions needed for committing a mortal sin. What is venial sin? Venial sin is an act of disobedience to the law of God in a lesser matter, in a matter in its lesser matter, or in a matter less itself serious, but done without full knowledge of seriousness of the action or without full consent. So for a mortal sin, you need to have all, you have to know it's wrong. It has to be really bad. You got to know it's really bad and do it anyway. You don't need to know the language of mortal venial sin, all right? There's certain things that are like, yeah, this is wrong. We have a certain inherent kind of think like, well, this is of right and wrong. And so there's certain things that it's very hard for someone to say, well, there's no way, I didn't know that was wrong. Well, like, let's say murder, all right, that's pretty clear. There are other ones, but I think just laying the foundation, there's different types of sin, and we just want to, most importantly, we want to just do our best just to fight venial sin, so that mortal sin doesn't even become like even attractive. All right, serious sin just doesn't even have a place. All right, but if we fight this battle well, kind of fight our habits, sinful habits and stuff, and want to get rid of the venial sins, the smaller things, the mortal sins and stuff, it's very hard for them for us to commit one of them if we're fighting strongly against venial sins. All right, our saint today, Saint Bartholomew. Bartholomew was also known as Nathaniel. His friend Philip was a disciple of John the Baptist. One evening, Philip told Nathanael that John the Baptist had pointed out the Messiah as the Lamb of God, who takes away the sins of the world. And they both went to Jesus. When Jesus saw the 2 friends coming, he spoke to Nathanael, "Behold, an Israelite indeed in whom there is no deceit." Nathanael then made an act of faith. "Master, you are the Son of God. You are the King of Israel." To be so pure and noble that even the Lord considered him without deceit is the great honor of Nathanael. He was honest and simple and strong in faith. Nathanael was on the lake shore when Jesus showed himself after the resurrection and had breakfast with some of the apostles. After the ascension of Jesus, Nathanael preached the gospel in Arabia and India. He suffered martyrdom in Arabia. His skin was cut off from his living body. So, St. Bartholomew, kind of one of the apostles. So we ask for his intercession that we be without deceit. What does that mean? Without deceit? Well, without lie, without kind of this honest in our words and also in our actions. So Saint Bartholomew, help us be without deceit, honest in our words and our actions. Amen. Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit.